Great stuff. Well, hello and a warm welcome to you all. Thanks so much for joining us today. My name is Marc Morley, and I'm delighted to be hosting another event for the Good Governance Academy. As always, it's great to see so many registrations coming from returning guests, but also a lot of newcomers. So welcome to you all. Please let us know where you're from in the chat window below. It's always nice to see which countries are being represented. I can see there are more people joining. So while we wait, I'll share some Zoom tips for those not familiar with this platform. If you can't see the control panel along the bottom of your screen, press the Alt key on your keyboard. That will give you access to the chat box and the question box and the reaction buttons. Don't be afraid to applaud or hit the thumbs up to show your support for our guests. If you have any questions during the event, please pop these in the question box, not the chat box, and I'll be happy to ask these either during the discussion or at the end. Please also feel free to use the chat box to share your thoughts at any time. And we encourage you to connect with each other, and I'll be sharing our LinkedIn details shortly. For those not familiar with the Good Governance Academy, we're a non-profit organization that was established by Professor Mervyn King in 2019. We collaborate with organizations all around the world to educate and empower leaders of organizations, both large and small. We run regular webinars on issues that matter. And if you'd like to see what we have planned, please head over to our events page, which I'll post a link to in the chat window below. I'd also encourage you to join our mailing list, follow us on LinkedIn, and also subscribe to us on YouTube to ensure that you never miss an event. In addition to the webinars, we host Colloquia twice a year, our 13th event, which looks at optimizing governance, where regulation and deregulation align, will be held on the 15th of May. Registrations are open now on our website. These high-profile events have been attended by thousands of people, so please make sure you check them out. We also run showcase events to promote courses which the Academy has endorsed. The endorsement program is available to organizations all around the world and involves a robust assessment to ensure that the highest standards are maintained. The courses we endorse are those which address a broad range of governance-based topics and provide users with current and relevant content. Today's webinar focuses on the power of purpose in our organizations and specifically our leadership. And I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Victoria Hurth and our own CEO, Carolynn Chalmers. Victoria and Carolynn were both heavily involved in the development of the ISO standard for the governance of organizations. And Victoria is now leading the development of ISO 37011, which is the standard for purpose-driven organizations. So Victoria and Carolynn, thanks so much for joining us today. We really appreciate your time. Victoria, can I ask you to introduce yourself first, and then we'll hand over to Carolynn to begin our fireside chat.
Yes, fantastic. Thank you, Mark. And so great to be here with you all. And I'm just looking at all the numbers and I'm thinking I'm never going to get a chance to connect with you all. So please, I put my LinkedIn address up top. So it'd be great to connect that way. I love LinkedIn for that. So I'm an independent academic, which means that I deliberately sit in between theory and practice. I believe we need both. We need to be in that like uncomfortable bit in the middle. I have really for all my life, so probably definitely over 3 decades, just really been focusing on how do we align our decision making with the future that we want. You know, as human beings, clearly we're off track on that. It was a pertinent question then, and it's definitely one now. And I've been in many roles, in commercial roles, in organizations, boundary spanning essentially different levels and different parts of the system in order to really help the world clarify. And that's why I do a lot of standards building, and I'm sure we'll get to that as a sort of, helping the world to be clear about what it wants and how it makes decisions so that it gets there.
Thanks, Victoria. Great. Okay,
Carolynn, actually, I said that we'd hand over to you, but I just wanted to ask, actually, firstly, from one of my own questions is, how do we get here? Why do we need standards to help companies define, share, and act on their purpose?
Me or Victoria?
This is we can start with Victoria, and then it'd be great to hear you chime in.
Does everyone know you, Carolynn? You need no introduction. I mean,
yeah, it's fine.
Well, Carolynn has huge amounts to say on this also, but I think we just we have a problem when we think about standards and when we think about governance as rules, like unnecessary rules. I think it's testament to the fact that we are not good at making good decisions and have lots of unnecessary rules, that when we hear that, we think, oh, that's and I think Carolyn just showed me a clip of our friend across the pond from the UK talking about how standards are just there to stop people selling things. In other words, to stop us making profits from things that they should be allowed to. In other words, things that might harm us, work not so well, etc., etc. So standards really are just an expression of a norm. And so norms and standards, that those words are interchangeable. And what it really does is say, what do we as a society think is a minimum bar that needs to be there for things to go well? So laws embed that in the standards in hard law. But before something becomes hard law is like a last resort, where you're not last resort, but it's where something is so apparent that everyone just wants it to be literally not done. But to get to the point of being clear, yeah, that can be a law because it's so fundamental. You have to have standards to reveal that norm, to kind of express it. And then there are certain things that are actually, because they require flexibility and movability, it's better not to have them in law. It's better to have them in standards. So we have to see them as sort of complementary, but really they're there just to make sure that the world works in a way that reflects what we think it should do. Carolyn, I don't know, I'm sure you have lots to add.
Absolutely. I'm busy commenting in the chats, but I absolutely agree. I often talk about the laws as being society's, it's a point of common society, lowest common denominator, as you said. Anything, the society agrees that anything less than this is unacceptable, and there will be penalties, real penalties. Anything above that really is what where we should be living anyway. It's doing your best. And I think that's where the hard laws, really are, that's compliance. And I think one of the things that we've really battled with in governance, and certainly when we were writing 37,000 and trying to convey that. And for those who don't know, ISO 37,000 is the governance of organizations standard. It's a guidance standard. And it's really about how can you do your best? How can you do your best when you're governing an organization? So that is the standard for helping people to understand what doing your best looks like when governing an organization, as opposed to the laws that regulate you need to have a board of directors and you need to have an audit committee of your certain size and all of those kinds of things. So I like what you're saying, Victoria, in the terms of the distinction. And yes, our friend across the pond.
Yeah, well, absolutely. And maybe the other thing around that, though, is that we are now in a position where we understand that our laws are inadequate and they're also leading in the wrong direction. So what standards enable us to do is to sort of soft test whether things work, whether the language is right, whether those are the minimum bars. Because once you get them into hard law, there's a massive cost associated with administering them, like you said, Carolyn, having proper, recourse on them. However, we know that we've got to reform the laws to be able to align what we do with the world we want. In other words, long-term well-being for all. And that's where I think the governance standard and the standard in purpose-driven organizations we're talking about should be seen as the basis on which we can reform laws in the future, so that we are making and enabling and promoting the kinds of organizations that we want and need in the world, and stopping those that we really cannot afford.
Can I quickly ask, so with the ISO standards, they are generally quite difficult to consume. I mean, they're really developed for practitioners, people that are kind of really ingrained in these things. The governance of organizations was a kind of refreshing, that it seemed to be more practical, a bit more palatable. So it's accessible by more people. Is that something you're conscious of as you're developing this new standard? It needs to be not just for a specific group of people, but it needs to be much more palatable.
Well, it's always an interesting question, palatability versus technical. And I say versus obviously they're not mutually incompatible, but sometimes they can be. And the versus is integral coherence and technical substance. And the way I always describe it is, I see these core standards, and I agree, 37,000 went further in that, but still, and especially I think with 3711, we can see them as like diamonds, really hard diamonds in the core that are maybe a little bit impenetrable, maybe a little bit difficult to comprehend unless you spend enough time on them. And when we're talking about whole-scale organizational paradigm shift and being able to really make sure that we create decisions that we want, then that's a small price to pay. And it does require a level of effort that we might not be used to. And I think that's okay. So you have this diamond at the core, but then there's the ability to create all kinds of interpretations, on-ramps to it, you know, for certain sectors, certain countries, you know, and that will kind of bring out, draw out, make sense of. But what we cannot do, but which we do in probably most other documents that we write, is sacrifice what needs to be said, even if it means repeating and repeating, because you, instead of saying a word that will break up the sentence and be slightly different to the word before, you say, no, it's got to be that word because that word matters. And so this necessarily makes it slightly impenetrable, but I think that's okay. It's much better that it does the job that it does. And I think that's the thing. What is the job it's doing? The job it's doing is creating technical coherence that we can all lean on. Then we can do the nice stuff around the edge.
Do you think that we, or the world, was ready for this purpose-driven organizations before the governance organizations? Was it purpose that, or was it on purpose that it was, you waited till now to, you know, for the previous standard to be done? Do you think we could have skipped that, or do you think no, that's a definite necessary step?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think probably what I need to do first is to maybe give a bit of an introduction as to what the standard is and where it fits in the world. Right. Carolyn, I know you're still busy engaging with everyone on the chat, but so please, you know, chip in when you want. But I think, yeah, maybe if I start with that, the basic premise is that sustainability, the word sustainability, or the concept of it, if we go back to the Brundtland report, the definition of the goal of the economy, the mandate of governments globally, and what is humanity's meta purpose, if we ask enough whys, like why is something good, we get to the same place, which is long-term well-being for all. So it's not just any old thing, it's well-being. We need to constantly debate what that is. It's not just for some people, it's for everyone. All shared ethics will be, and it's not just now, but it's for the future, including future generations, and non-human and non-human life. So if we distill that and then say, well, that's what we want, that is what is under threat, because an unsustainable world really means an existential threat to our collective long-term well-being for all. So once we move beyond vague concepts to something concrete like that, then we can say what I believe is the question in the room, and the ultimate question: if that's what we want, how do we make decisions routinely that maximize the probability that that will be the case, that we will have a world with optimized long-term well-being for all, and therefore where it is not destroyed? And that requires every organization, at a minimum, any organization anywhere in the world, to be able to say, we exist in a way that the resources we have access to, we use to do something that drives long-term well-being for all, and we can prove and are sure that we are maximizing the probability that we are not harming long-term well-being for all in the process. If we imagine that is the ultimate governance frame, and this is where I'll connect with ISO 37000, and why we couldn't have this standard without that is because 37000 was the first time that we had a global consensus view on the foundations of what we mean by governance that is firstly applicable to any country or organization in the world. That didn't exist before. And what also didn't exist was an expression of governance that is aligned with our collective best interest, rather than aligned with a very specific view of how we achieve our best interest, which is via organizations being set up for their own self-interest. That is the logic of organizations and business that we live with today. And that meant that our version of governance had grown up. So governance goes back to Plato, but it, as a discipline, had grown up based around stock exchanges trying to protect financial investment for investors. That is not a view of governance that will enable us to ensure that decisions are aligned with the future we want. And the three aspects that came out of 37,000, which is so critical, and then I'll pick up and finalize the thread on the purpose-driven organizations, is that governance is direction, oversight, and accountability. It's a human-based system for doing that to achieve a defined purpose. So those three things. Direction, you then oversee. Have we achieved our direction? Are we doing it? And are we accountable to significant others for that fact? So both oversight and accountability are hinged on direction. So if we don't understand what the direction is, we can neither oversee nor be accountable for it. And direction is essentially two fundamental things. It's what are we trying to achieve within what parameters? And once you're clear about that, then you can make strategy and have strategic discussions about strategic choices, and you can weigh up your options because you are weighing them up against optimizing for X value generation while protecting Y, ABC value generation. So you can't talk about strategy until you have that direction, and you cannot oversee it and you cannot be accountable for it. So that leads us to ISO 37,000, which based on those fundamentals of governance can turn around and answer what I think is humanity's ultimate question. And that's not understating how important this standard is and why we all need to co-own it, because what it does is say, how do we govern organizations so that routine decisions that are made are maximizing the probability that they are doing something positive for long-term well-being for all and not destroying it in the process. The rest is strategy. And we need to have those complex strategic discussions. And by the time we finish the sentence, the conditions for strategy will have changed. At the moment, we're in a system that's killing us, and we are plugging the holes with rules and bureaucracy and trying to tweak the existing system until we can clearly see what that system of decision-making looks like. We cannot judge how far away we are. We cannot judge what laws need to go and what need to come in. So it is no less important than that. And that's really what it is. It's just simple. It's saying if we want a future like that, we need decisions that are aligned with it. And to do that, we need to govern them. So let's take what that looks like.
Yeah. Carolynn, do you have anything that you want to add to that?
No, absolutely. And the one thing that perhaps I can bring to the conversation is that it's what Victoria was saying about that is aspirational and it's lovely. And then we are, have the rug pulled from under us when we have a complete antithesis view coming forward and setting a global precedent of saying that's not the way we do things now. We're happy plugging holes. In fact, even more so, we want to open those holes a little bit wider and create, trade, barriers, in fact, and not actually allow, the new kind of thinking to come through. So I think practically in the application of standards, as you asked, Mark, and this is kind of how we got there, is in terms of the standards, we've got the laws as the lowest common denominator. We've got standards that mustn't be seen as being bureaucracy, as really as enabling us. We do need to change the world order. I shouldn't say that lightly, but we need to change the way we do things. And perhaps, before we know what laws, etc., need to better reflect what society is demanding, we do need to have what does that look like, and how to get to that position. Practically what that means for organizations is, first of all, we're very grateful for people like Victoria, all of the free time and effort you're putting in to get this done, to set that international standard. And I know the blood, sweat, and tears that goes into herding the cats around the world to agree on certain things. And South Africa has a big voice in that, I know. So to get us to that point, that's one thing. The other is now, once we've got that kind of view, how do we get ourselves there? How do we get our organizations there? And I think that's where conversations like this and I posted on the chat. In fact, Victoria gave us an overview of PAS 808, which was the standard on which 3711 is built. Almost exactly a year ago.
Was
so
it really?
Yeah, in May last year. So conversations like this are so important, because while that the light is being developed in terms of what does it look like, we should be engaging in this thought process in terms of what does it mean for me in my organization? What do I need to look at changing, and where can I play, and what part can I play in this process?
Yeah, I absolutely agree, Carolyn. And I think that I think what it's going to really require, and this is where I think we can get into some of that practical reality, is that frank discussion that says, how far away is company X, system Y, government L from that system? What are the laws and regulations that are holding back this existing or supporting it existing? And my hope is that when we are clear about that destination, we can have those very tangible and specific discussions, and therefore drive accountability and change. For example, and that might lead to some interesting consequences, right? So, for example, if we know that nearly all business models are asset stripping at the moment, we know that just getting up in the morning and doing anything is probably doing harm, right? We got to start from that position. There are then degrees of harm. There are harm created, but harm avoided by creating harm. There are all these sorts of specificities, which with the standard we can be clearer to be more intentional about the harm we're creating or not. So it may mean that some companies and industries, we as society or as a group of society, say it's worth having that harm in order to either A, transition, or B, because we're going to have other sectors or companies that do extra well in order to preserve that, because it does something important for our long-term well-being for all, which is has to be the decision-making frame within which we decide. For individual companies, it might be, well, hang on a minute, yeah, we really, if we're going to retain that product or service in our portfolio that does that harm, we're going to have to offset that somehow within our portfolio. Or should we just get rid of it? Because that's much easier to align ourselves to long-term well-being for all, for getting away from that. For others, it might be, God, literally our whole business model is misaligned with long-term well-being for all. We can see this now. So do we do what DSMs and Orsted do, and we clear out the factory from under the shell and we rebuild an organization, keeping our brand, keeping everything else? Or do we shut shop and start again? Or do we try and lobby government and others to create conditions whereby, because we can see that our market, our industry, our product could be aligned with long-term well-being for all if X, Y, and Z happened. But that's not in our power to do that, because we've done the assessment, and therefore we would need to lobby government and work with others. And it's the intentionality of understanding and owning collectively and individually, where are we doing harm in relation to long-term well-being for all? Where's our capacity to drive and really generate value, and at least to get ourselves within minimum thresholds? And what are those thresholds? Until we can, if we are in positions of power and allocating resources that ultimately affect everybody's collective long-term well-being for all, at a minimum, we need to say, how do we get ourselves to a point that we are not harming it? Now, that's what ESG was trying to achieve. Now, we can pretend, and politics can nicely say, it's okay. The real reality will go away if you just follow us. I mean, we know this is not going to happen, right? ESG is not anything more than trying to get ourselves into a position that we're not fundamentally asset stripping ourselves with every decision we make. Now, I think we can do this a lot better, and in terms of setting out the vision and how we do it. But the reality is, whatever you call it, is going to be them. So, yeah, that's
I'm going to butt in. So Firdousa's got a very good question, and it's exactly what you were saying, Victoria. It's around. So her question is basically, you take a standard, you implement it, you certify yourself against the standard, but trying to get everybody to buy in. Let me just read what she's saying. So. Great having all of these standards and governance, but her challenge is having adherence to these standards as I'm looked at as I come up with the standards, okay, I have trouble at all levels, from CEOs to everybody, to adhere to simple international standards, even if you show them a hard copy of the standards. And that is our forever ending argument. But Victoria, you said it, and it's actually not so much about, let's think about purpose in a different way. What is the purpose of that standard? What value are you trying to generate by adopting that standard? Is it to the point where that standard, you need to absolutely adhere to the standard because of the risk is so high if you don't? So cybersecurity, information security, ISO 27001, right? There is a management system standard that has been absolutely proven, organization by organization, that this approach works, and it really helps. And what you can do, if you certify yourself against that standard and you make sure you stick to that rule, others can then be comfortable, more comfortable, that you are doing things in the right way, and you really have got the information security in hand, because that's what 27,000 does. But so the purpose of adopting a standard and implementing a standard needs to be well understood, not only in terms of the actual standard, but in terms of the value that it's generating for the organization, for the people that depend on the organization, and perhaps even in the case of the environmental footprint of, the resources that are used to make sure that the servers are right and the information remains secure. So I do think the same is applicable right from the very, you're talking about laws and government all the way through the organization. So I often talk about we don't stop. We're so busy governing the business or managing the business, we don't stop to consider the business of managing or the business of governing. So the business of governing is to stop and ask yourself these questions. Because if you don't maintain your governance, it's like not cleaning your washing machine and your dishwasher. The very things that are cleaning things for you, you never clean. You don't maintain them. And that's what we're doing with our boards. That's what we're doing with management, is we spending so much time managing and governing, but we don't stop and actually consider how the business of governing and the business of the purpose of the organization. What is this organization all about, really? And do we ever make a gap for ourselves to do that, even as a manager? And circling back then to the standards that we're talking about, for those, are not certifiable standards. We understand that there's laws and standards, and that becomes a compliance requirement. A certification is a compliance obligation. It's a voluntary compliance standard. We're talking about doing your best, so beyond the minimum. And so this is beyond a compliance. So looking at this purpose of the organization and creating a standard for it, this standard is a guidance standard. So this standard provides you with how can you do your best when it comes to the purpose of the organization. It doesn't say, and you need to be certified. As far as I understand, Victoria, maybe you can talk more about that certifiable and non-certifiable.
Well, yeah, I mean, ultimately, everything forms your compliance obligations, including the law, which, I got into trouble saying this, but it's true. It's a choice, right? A lot of people fail to tell the people in their organizations they also need to obey the law. But then it all falls under your compliance obligations. And we have a real issue with this sort of sense of this term compliance culture. For some people, that's like, oh my God, we need a compliance culture. It's so important because it's really positive if we have one. And then other people are, oh, it's this compliance culture. So we've got this like really weird relationship with it. But ultimately what it means is we're doing what we said we'd do, But the question is, why did you say you would do it, right? Now you say you will do the law because if the risk is too great, you'll end up in prison, right? It's all about a risk analysis, right? On that basis. Then other things, and this is where ISO 3711 comes in, because it's around true intentionality. The reality is we've been on a treadmill of what I would call logic one, because for 80 to 100 years, we've embedded a way of viewing the economy and organizations based on very particular and specific sets of assumptions. It's not, but we see it now as if that's just the way that it is. And so everything that we do, and this is why we have, I think, this toxic compliance culture, because that system, which is based on financial self-interest or survival of an organization, forget everything else, really. Very short-term and narrow. And we've got a book coming out in October, which will kind of like, and there's other resources online around these logics, because I think it really helps to answer this question. Because in answering the question, why are we doing it, you have to understand what is the logic and rationale of your organization. And I would say there are three key logics: short-term self-interest, long-term self-interest, and other serving purpose-driven interest. And ISO 37011 is that logic 3, other serving, aligned with long-term well-being for all people and planet. Logic 1 and 2 are variations of business as usual, which is this set of assumptions that say we exist for X, Y, and Z. And so compliance becomes toxic, because what it is because that system which says, I focus on my financial or on my survival, and the most important resource for that is financial stocks and flows of capital, and that's the only thing I'm really obliged to count. We create therefore a governance frame for strategy which is so small that long-term well-being for all, both in terms of being an innovative goal, because it is the ultimate goal, and everything that underpins long-term well-being for all is not in the governance system. And so you end up in an unsustainable world. And when the problems hit, the only way you can respond is if you can protect your financial short-term self-interest. Now, if you're that kind of organization and you're saying, why would I adopt 3711? The only thing that will make rational sense is because I've got a business case that by being purpose-driven, I'm going to make more short-term financial self-interest. And hence you get purpose washing. And that's happened everywhere. And we see it and we know it, but we need to name it. We need to say that's logic 1. And actually, that's not just like happened by random. We've made that the de facto way of governing our organizations. Now, then we bring in ASG, because as we start hitting these walls and the pressure comes in, and we're going, we can't just keep placating stakeholders. What the hell's going on? What is this news? Davos is telling me I should be worried about climate change. Maybe my financial self-interest is threatened in anything but the short term, unless I look a little bit longer out. So you end up with an enlightened self-interest. Now, that's where the risk-based conversation around a broader compliance agenda comes in, because you can start to say, well, it's in our best interest in anything but the short term to adopt standard X or Y and comply to it, because if we don't, we're not going to have a world where we can even make any money. So it's an enlightened, but you're still existing to serve yourself. And as long as you can filter that innovation or investment case through, well, yeah, ultimately it'll make us as much money as possible, you can act. Now, logic 3 is a different way of approaching it. It's saying the goal of the economy is long-term well-being for all. Why are we inefficiently and ineffectively saying, let's make as much money as possible, hope the market somehow spits out optimal well-being, when we can just actually innovate for well-being and make sure that we are protecting it in an enlightened way at the same time? And that's what it does. So to adopt it, and adopt it for the reasons it's actually going to make it work, means the organization having that moment, like you said, Carolyn, where you stand back and say, what are we even here for, really, guys? Now, many organizations have gone through that. Or why we used to be here for, take Unilever, take, so many of the, pre-100 year ago organizations, we existed to do something useful in the world. We forgot that in the 70s, 80s, 90s, where logic 1 went, really drove home. Let's rediscover that. So there is, like you say, but let's face it, and I'll just pause there after that and hand back, but we are in a one-way street with tsunamis of chaos from our destroyed social and environmental systems coming behind us. This is not going away. It's going to get much worse. If someone is not raising their head above the parapet and going, oh my God, there's something really, really difficult going on here, we need to rethink everything, they're not doing it today. They're probably going to do it tomorrow or next week. So the question is, at what point are you as an organization, or those that lead and can take the organization on the journey, able to have these conversations? And last thing is to say, at the beginning of the working draft, the British standard in purpose-driven organizations, and I hope will be retained for the international, is a set of worldviews at the beginning that say, if you're a purpose-driven organization, these will be your fundamental assumptions about what is valuable and how the world works. And if you do not, or at least the majority of senior decision makers align with most of these, this journey is not for you. So.
Do you think, though, that this is even viable for publicly traded companies? Because there's only so much they can do, before they start upsetting shareholders and investors. And surely we need those people to be bought into this before a company can even try.
Well, I think there are three. We could take everything needs to happen everywhere all at once, but let's just take publicly traded. The reason they're publicly traded in that way, the reason the laws or the interpretation of the laws are in that way is because government holds that in place, the companies themselves hold it in place, the investors hold it in place, and society as a whole ultimately holds it in place. It's not going to take much if all those stakeholders turn around and say, this isn't working, we need to change it, right? So for every individual and organization, it's about being the voice that says, hey, is anyone joining me in saying we need to change this? We've seen how far, and it's brilliant that Paul Polman showed us how far you can take a publicly listed company down this purpose-driven journey, how far you need a charismatic leader to almost smoke and mirrors, make sure that everyone feels happy, but ultimately you're going in this direction. But then when he stood back, of course, the logic won, pulled in, and it was always going to, because ultimately in publicly listed or logic one organizations, the only way you can be purpose driven is through basically bad governance. I would say ultimately it's bad governance, because you're not supposed to be doing that, but a charismatic leader can push those boundaries. Now, I think we need collective recognition that that's the case, but we can't know that until we can name that problem and we can name what the solution looks like, which is why we need that standard so that we feel empowered and confident to say where that gap exists.
Right.
If I can add to that, Mark, you can even make it more fundamental. So every legislation around the world in terms of governance talks about acting in the best interest of the organization. So the decisions made by the governing body, by the board of a publicly listed entity, must be the decisions made in the best interest of the company. And if they are making the decisions, that 101 basic, if they are making interest in the best decisions in the best interest of the company, and that company is being impacted by the environment, floods and fires and tornadoes, etc., and if that company is potentially in the longer term going to be impacted by floods and fires and various things, they need to make decisions with that in mind, because then that is acting in the best interest of the company. The second thing is on society. If you have a society where the majority of the society is poverty-stricken, etc., how are you going to sell your goods? So look at the long-term interests of society if you want your organization to operate in the longer term. So we do need to think about 101. Yes, it's about purpose. We can see all the benefits of an organization's embracing this, and then we have other people argue the counter of it. But fundamentally, is the decision you're making in the best long-term interest of this organization? And long-term is relative as well. So a special purpose vehicle that is created specifically to manage a financial transaction for tax purposes, etc. Well, we understand its purpose and we understand its term. Its term is very definitive. So you still have a governing body, you still have a board of that special purpose vehicle if you're creating a separate legal entity, a separate legal persona, and you need to make decisions in the best interest of that special purpose vehicle for the duration that is expected to exist, right? And we don't see that. Lots of it is just checking the boxes and, okay, it's a shelf company. Essentially, it's doing its thing. It's a shelf company. Now we have other organizations that are manufacturing, agriculture, banking, etc. How are they making decisions in the best interest of their organizations when they are not a special purpose entity? There's no end point to that. The end point is, as long as this organization survives and exists, that end point is much longer. And then you've got the end point of, well, the next generation coming through. Where do they think the end point is? So you get that more, is this end point, my term as CEO or my term as president, or, is it the 4 years? Is it the 2 years as a director? or is long-term really the stability of the organization for future generations? So just from 101, acting in the best interests of the organization for a publicly listed entity, you cannot ignore this stuff. You're not a thinking person if you aren't.
It's so interesting that that we touch on this. It's obviously absolutely critical, because I think what's interesting, because what you've expressed there, Carolyn, is really that sort of interpretation that allows that enlightened self-interest to really, and we've seen the moves to really support that. And with purpose-driven organizations, essentially it's an interpretation one stage further, to say that if you establish an organization to be existing, to be aligned with long-term well-being for all, and you're clear and you're publicly open about what that is, and that you are clear about what you will protect, at that same time, then you are essentially saying the best interests of the organization is to achieve its purpose and not to breach its defined limits, in which case, and there's a whole school of thought around this, some fantastic academics, Segriston and somebody else, who it essentially, because let's face it, this is where we're ultimately getting to, is the economy takes shared resources and allocates them to optimize for long-term well-being for all. When we create organizations, we give them the right to access those. And so Principle 1 in the British Standard, which, and I don't know how it will end up in the ISO, but I hope the same, says that you start by saying that our accountability, our commitment, the ultimate beneficiaries is everyone forever, because they are the ones that have given us the right to have the ability to exist in the first place. And therefore, our existence is to serve those ultimate beneficiaries and not harm them. So if that becomes the frame, the very clear and publicly stated frame for which that organization exists, then the best interest of the organization is achieving that purpose, even, and this is really important, even if that means that the organization ends up not surviving. And I think that we really have to bring that in the room, because survival for its own sake is essentially then an organization operating in self-interest. And if we think that's okay, then we need to say that, but we need to recognize that that will always misalign ultimately with long-term well-being for all.
Oh, that's a difficult one.
Does the standard, or I'm just curious, does the standard call on any other frameworks, like human rights frameworks or something, that kind of can teach organizations how to, to do the right thing? Because that's effectively what we're hoping they do.
Well, I mean, this is what's interesting, because obviously it's a whole organizational system. And so all the other standards that are out there, even in the technical committee, so there are ones on modern slavery, ones on, compliance, ones on risk. And so it's sort of, there's, we're going to make sure to have anchor points to these standards that are out there. But ultimately, and that's why the frame of long-term well-being and recognizing that that is what sustainability is so important. So we don't say, oh, that's climate change, or that's green stuff, or that it's not. It's long-term well-being for all people and planet. That means, it is all encompassing. And therefore, human rights are not something different. Human rights are about our right to a minimum level of well-being. That's what it is, right? Climate change is about protecting the health of a system. And why do we care about that system? Addressing climate change is not an end goal. We care about climate change because it underpins our collective long-term well-being. So what it will do is help orientate all those parts of the system. And what we're seeing with ESG, of course, is also that trying to bring all these parts. So human rights are in there, and as are, is climate change and biodiversity loss. But what 3711 does is take that holistic starting point. So what are all the issues that affect long-term well-being for all? Let's not just take 6 and hope we can deal with them in partial ways. Let's see what the end point's going to have to look like. And that means all of them, unfortunately. Yeah.
I think that is one of the things that I see as going to be like a quick win for this, because there are so many companies that appear they could put a purpose statement on the wall, but if you ask any one of the employees in this huge organization what the purpose is, no one will have any idea. And so if companies can clearly define a purpose so that anyone within that organization knows what their own role is in reaching that purpose, then I think it makes everything much more likely to be effective.
I mean, honestly, it is very, very clear, certainly the British standard, and I'm sure this one will be as well, that if you exist to create that value and not destroy that value, that you have public duty to care, everything that you do is about that. Nothing is not about that. And then the question is, how do you operationalize that? What type of structure do you use? What sort of governance do you have? And those are strategic questions, and they need to be seen as such and consciously made. But absolutely. But I'd say for the majority of organizations that have a purpose, my understanding, working with executives of all shapes and sizes everywhere, is that the purpose really is, what does the governing system say it is? And that is usually to make as much money as possible. And that is the gap that we have at the moment. We have intentions created that are misaligned with the fundamental governance system, and governing bodies and executives trying to implement intentions without realizing that if they don't change their fundamental governance system, they will never realize those intentions. So this gap, I think, of understanding the role of governance, and I'm sure, Carolyn, you have many stories about that as well, is at all levels of the system. We need a fundamental, so this would be my fundamental, if we do not have a base level of literacy in the average population, not just people working as executives, in the average population around how decisions are made, and therefore how they are governed, and therefore how we can be accountable for them and hold them to account. We're not going to do this, guys. We're not going to get there.
And I think that's so important is sorry, Mark, the concept of fundamental understanding. So it's something that people get appointed in a board position or a management position, and they're taught, what are the disciplines around management, and they've got learning organizations and all of these kinds of things. But can anyone actually recall? And to your point, Mark, recall is what we get our children to go to school and recall the 2 times table so that it's muscle memory. Can we actually recall, well, sitting on a board of directors, does the board know its purpose for being there? Can it state its purpose? Can it recall it? Has it got a muscle memory around it? If it hasn't got a muscle memory, as it's making decisions, it's not applying it because there's no muscle memory there. They're just doing it instinctively from gut feel. They are knee-jerking. They're responding immediately with their lens on their ladder of inference, what they've come up with. We need to have these things as muscle memory so that when we're pushed into a corner, when we're making decisions, that it is instinctive, that it's in that frame of reference. So I think we miss out on that. We don't get our boards to essentially sit down and be able to recall. We don't get our managers to sit down and be able to recall. So you can ask, we all set out a purpose in ISO 37000. Purpose goes hand in glove with values. So it's how you need to have the values to be able to realize your purpose. Can anyone in any organization recite their values? And I think you probably have a few because it's important to them, but your values of your organization need to be muscle memory. So if it means writing exams on it, if it means that level of making sure it's in your DNA, maybe we need to do that. Sorry, Victoria.
Yeah, I love that. And also to say what they also need to be is they need to be parameters for decision making that are overseen and accountable to. And that's what 3711 will, and what was in the British standard, make really clear. It's a nice piece of paper on a wall. Unless it's in governance, it's a nice idea. And I think we just need to get that really embedded, because then we'll have far fewer CSOs and others banging their head against the wall, wondering why stuff's not happening, or any executives. And by the way, I've seen a question in the chat that I just addressed that builds on what we've just been saying now. It's in the Q&A. And it's basically, a disconnect between standard setters prioritizing long-term impact and business executives.
It's gone.
Yeah, no, it's moved to the. I've got it on the other tab. Okay. That's fine. And business executives more focused on immediate short-term results. Could we design sustainability standards to provide short-term benefits as well, so both perspectives are accommodated? This would make it easier for business executives to adopt these standards, considering. Okay, so I would say that gets to the heart of what I said before. I'd say no, not unless we reconcile what we mean by short-term results or short-term performance with long-term performance. So the idea that we can all make as much money as we possibly can for our own self-interest, and that somehow we're going to have positive long-term impacts, that ship sailed a while ago, and we're pretty clear now that those things are not compatible, which means what we need is for short-term results to be aligned with short-term results to optimizing for long-term well-being for all and not harming it, while obviously, of course, having the healthy stocks and flows of financial capital, but also all the other capitals, health of the social and environmental systems, and health of the stakeholders. Those are all the dependencies. It's not just financial stocks and flows health. So we need all of those to be healthy, to be, like you say, Carolyn, a going concern. That means then, and this is what's really important, that the term performance or success is only in relation to that governance direction, that organizational direction. What are we trying to achieve within what parameters? Success is achieving that within those parameters. Performance is how well have you achieved that goal within those parameters. So you would need a short-term success to be anchored to performance of your long-term success. But having two logics that are not hitting, this is why we're in the bureaucratic mess that 30 years later, all of the indicators are still going in the wrong direction in terms of our ability to have a good life going forward.
This comes to the, should we have short-term appointments then? Like 4 years in government? Certainly we don't want to have...
Yeah, well, you see, no, but this is where we get right into the heart of it. And I love that question because, right, if we think about the governance, it goes all the way from governing of the self. And this is also in the book, by the way, this sort of sense of this whole system, right? Governance of the self should also be aligned with long-term well-being for all. That's what spirituality and religion tries to help us with, right? All the way up to the biggest system, right? So if we think about, we happen to have nation states. We've cut the world in that way. Lots of people talking for bioregional states, but we have nation states. Relatively recent innovation. So we have citizens that are the ultimate governing body. I mean, all citizens of planet Earth are the ultimate, human and non-human, but in terms of being able to enact that and make decisions, humanity is the ultimate governing body. In a nation, it's the nation's citizens. Those citizens delegate to government to govern on our behalf. Now, what we have in forgetting that, and citizens kind of going downhill because we've said the market will sort all this out. We don't need to worry anymore. We don't really have to be citizens because the market will do its thing. Now we're realizing we're going to have to take on our citizenship again. And that means governing government. Now, yes, it would be great if we could change four-year cycles, but do you really want a really bad person in for more than 4 years? I don't think that's going to solve it either. What we need is to govern governments. To do that, we need to set that infrastructure, that governing infrastructure that says this is your goal, government, and these are your parameters, and this is how we will, as citizens, oversee and hold you to account to that. Within that, you can come and go for 4 years, but just be clear that we're checking that you are achieving this goal that we as society have decided within these parameters. Now, what we're saying in 37,000 is that at a minimum, because governments are organizations too, so we can use 37,000 for them and every layer of government. And we know that governments are mandated for long-term well-being for all. It's in the public sector accounting standards boards. It says it in black and white. So all we're doing is saying, right, we're going to govern you to that. Because yes, everyone has different perspectives about what is well-being and how to achieve it, but we can at least say, government, you exist to optimize for our long-term collective well-being, which we know is anchored to the well-being of everyone on the planet because we're not disconnected. And in doing that, we want you to make sure that you don't destroy our long-term well-being in the process, especially not in your 4 years where you're just trying to gain favor and look good by destroying us in the longer term. That's what we need. And if we citizens can take that on, then we manage this imperfect democracy idea.
So in South Africa, I think that was we tried to do that with the new constitution. We cannot have social injustice anymore. We saw how unsustainable it was. You can't do that. It's inclusive, it's stakeholder inclusive. And we got a new constitution as a result, which is essentially a new purpose statement for the country that said, this is where we are, this is the Bill of Rights, etc. It was all baked and we agreed. And it all went horribly wrong because the citizens then went, lovely, we've got a purpose statement, guys, go for it. And exactly as you say,
the infrastructure,
we didn't actively govern as citizens.
And we didn't put all the governance infrastructure. So that would be a fantastic case study, wouldn't it, to kind of go into that, to say, because those and that's what's so beautiful, that while like we talk about, you know, it might be dense, it might be technical, 3711, but it gives us the blueprint to ask questions at all levels of the system about projects, about departments, about brands, about government, about whole nations, about the world, and about ourselves. To say, if we are not governing ourselves to do something useful with what we've been given for long-term well-being for all, and ensure we don't destroy it, then we are part of the problem and not the solution. And I think what that means is, to your point about literacy, Carolyn, is that we just need to be literate about these things, and we can apply them everywhere with the same language, because we've done ourselves a real disservice by saying, and it's part of logic one, oh, well, business is very different to charities, which is very different to government, and policy making and government, obviously we mean government policy making. That's not the same as like organization. It's like, hang a minute, no, they are all the same things. And once we do that, we empower ourselves to be able to be much better in governing.
So we've solved the world's problems. Mark, what's the next question?
I was just wondering, with the younger generations coming into the workforce, and I guess with no companies being safe environments now, so you're never going to go to a company and work there for 20 or 30 years. It just doesn't exist anymore. So it would seem that people seeking employment now are doing it more because that they align with the purpose of that company, rather than they considering it like a safe haven that the company's going to continue to make money forever. So do you think now is probably the best time for this standard, because there are those people out there that will ultimately, that the talent will kind of flow to those companies that are purpose driven, and so they'll ultimately, you know, become better value organizations, more successful?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we know that it's not just younger generations. Younger generations are just less consumed by this logic logic. They have not absorbed and drunk the Kool-Aid so much, but there are plenty of people who have drunk the Kool-Aid who are going, oh, maybe I need to detox because that really is not working. So I think we have a whole mass movement in that. But the important thing is also to just tie that in also with the realism. You know, 3711 is the ultimate destination. And like we say, everything about our system is sort of stopping us in a way to get there. So this is about an organization's intent to be that, and to be able to be realistic and clear about the path that it will take to get there. And to say to younger generations, to all of us, this is our plan. I mean, that's the best that we can do at this moment, is say, we're gonna get there. We've got this plan, but we need you to help us. Come and help us do this, right? But that's what we're going to hold ourselves accountable to, is getting there. So I think so it's not an unrealistic, hey, we're purpose driven, come and work with us and your life will just automatically be amazing. It's like, this is a struggle. This is our struggle. This is our journey to get to somewhere where actually we can at least say that we deserve to exist as an organization, because ultimately I think that's probably, if we were going to say what the challenge is for all organizations now, given how fast things are declining, it's in 5-10 years, would society say that you deserve to exist, you know, because you are genuinely not harming? And, you know, so I think for younger generations, it's a very exciting time, but it only is an exciting time if we get this level of clarity we're talking about here in the room. Otherwise, it is a deeply depressing time. And I see so many people go into organizations with nice words and nice ambition, but it really is just, like I say, a nice idea, because it's not anchored in what will change about the governance system.
I guess we're actually running close to the time now, but for people that are looking at this and thinking, okay, we want to be a purpose-driven organization, the standards coming out, is it going to be like a massive amount of work to kind of move from where we are now to where we should be? Are there kind
probably.
but are there kind of, I don't want to use quick wins when we're talking about purpose, but are there things that are kind of, that maybe people are already on the right track but need some kind of finessing or need some extra guidance?
I think the key thing is humans are at our and then maybe we can just quickly answer the US question. There's some stuff at the end there, but we're at our best when we are in a good struggle, when we know we're doing something important and it's hard and it's tough, but we understand and we're collectively working towards it. What purpose-driven organization and that framework and that clear framework does is to give us that shared foundation to be able to tap into what makes us truly human and makes us truly have a good life, which is serving the good of the other, and knowing that the efforts that we're doing are actually doing something good and they are effective in doing something good. So if we have good, strong governing bodies and management executives that can create a space where people can come to do that, that I think is, so that's the bit I would say to any organization. If you want, like, think about that what do you have in terms of that the essence of your culture that thrives and knows it thrives when it actually does something good for others, where you celebrate that. And that's the bit that to lean into, because that's the energy source that is a perpetual energy source and is the ultimate beautiful virtuous circle. The more we release our purpose, the more we achieve those things that then verify our purpose and drive us. And that's all that really we can do and start with. Our purpose-driven energy in an inert system is the only thing that will change things.
Wonderful. Thanks.
And the USA.
US question.
Yeah. Yeah, go Carolyn, yeah.
No, we've got 1 minute. You go, Victoria.
Well, it was saying it doesn't resonate within the USA. No, I mean, let's face it, the USA was born, I talked about those 80 to 100 years of neoliberal, neoclassical economic logic one thinking. That is what America built everything that it sees as its success on. It was always going to be very, very difficult for the US to change. And what Donald Trump is, while that is being threatened by enlightened self-interest and purpose, what Trump is doing is saying, hey, let's dig further in, like you said, Karen, let's dig further into logic one, because it's very difficult for them to be able to see that there are alternatives. We also know, however, that the beginnings of purpose and so much of that thought leadership has come from the US. So it's not that that's the whole story at all. It's just that it's a very easy, I call it wells, right? Tapping into the well of superficial self-interest and fear is a short well to tap into. But it is short and it's shallow and it doesn't go anywhere. It's harder to tap in the well that says, we're going to have to do the hard thing to get the good thing, right? And that this is what really matters. If we can get leaders that can start to really show this logic 3 and what it could achieve for us, I think we can counter it. But what we cannot do is keep our energy on tweaking the system. We have to realize most of our sustainability efforts have been about tweaking logic 1. If we don't clearly represent logic 3 and move there, we will not have and that's a market economy still, right? That's a version of capitalism. The alternative is command and control. So this whole left, right, we need to go beyond it. This is, do we want a market economy with its freedom, efficiency, and democracy effects, or do we want a command and control system? Think what happened in the pandemic. We are literally on that cusp, and don't let anyone on the Trump version of it tell you otherwise.
Thank you. Thanks, Victoria.
Yeah, thanks, Victoria, and thank you to Carolyn. I see we're at the top of the hour, so we need to draw the event to a close. But I'd like to thank Victoria and Carolyn for your participation today. We're so fortunate to be able to benefit from your insights, and I'm confident our chat today will have inspired some positive change. I certainly hope so. So thank you to our audience for joining us. We really appreciate your support too. And I hope we'll see everyone at our next event on the 12th of April. For those that did miss any or part of this, the video will be shared on YouTube and on LinkedIn, so make sure you subscribe to those channels to be kept informed. So thanks again to everyone, and look forward to seeing you again next time.
Thank you very much, Mark. Thanks for hosting, and sorry about my internet. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Victoria.
Thanks, Karen.
Thank you, Carolyn.
Victoria.
Thanks, Mark. Please connect on LinkedIn and all the rest. Okay.
And connect with us.